Good afternoon. My name is Sheehan-Dean. I'm the chair of the history department here at LSU, and I would like to welcome you to our series, Uncertainty Across the Arts and Sciences. I want to start by thanking some of the people who helped make this possible. ORED, the Office of Research and Economic Development here at LSU, and especially Julie Perkins and Holly Carruth, who've been essential. Julie is currently behind the scenes, making sure everything runs smoothly. The Center for Collaborative Knowledge, or CCK, and the Vogelin Institute, run by Professor Stoner out of the Department of Political Science. If you are looking for bios on the speakers or recordings, we have a recording of the first of these sessions, which happened 2 weeks ago. If you can't stay for all of today, there will be a recording made of this one posted on the Vogelin Institute website. I also want to make two quick announcements, and then I will give a few opening comments and then introduce our speakers who are going to talk for a couple of minutes in sequence, and then we will open it up to conversation and questions. The first announcement is that we have two more of these uncertainty seminars. The next one after this will be Wednesday, March 24th at 1:30 in the afternoon, and the last one, Wednesday, April 14th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That last one will have a special focus on Louisiana. And the chat feature has been disabled currently in our Zoom room, so we cannot post links to these events. If you Google LSU Uncertainty Seminars, it's basically the first Google hit if you need to find the Eventbrite, or you can contact any of us by email and we can steer you towards the proper registration and the dates if those went by too fast. At the risk of sounding like Mr. Robinson in His Neighborhood, as interpreted by Eddie Murphy, I'd like to start with a word of the day, and that word is precarity, or the state of being precarious or uncertain. And I choose this because I've been reading and hearing this word a lot more in recent years. It's a word of modern vintage. 1910 is the first recorded usage. And if you mark the word through Google's Ngram viewer, there is a sharp uptick in the usage of precarity starting around 2008, presumably connected to the housing and financial market crash. Hence the second definition, a state of persistent insecurity with regard to employment or income. And there are social or cultural dimensions to this concept as well. The third definition is an emerging abandonment that pushes us away from a livable life. Now, this may be a modern word and perhaps a uniquely contemporary one, but that hardly means we're the first people to encounter uncertainty. I'm a historian of the 19th century, and I can assure you that no matter how inevitable the nation state or capitalism or any of the 19th century's various consolation gifts appear now, nothing seemed fixed or certain for people living through that great century of change. Nonetheless, the relative ubiquity of a term like precarity suggests that more people feel a sense of uncertainty more acutely today than perhaps they did in the past. One of the aims with this series is to suggest that a partial solution to this problem comes from leaning on each other for wisdom. The modern university rests on a bedrock of interdependence. We rely on the expertise of specialists in different fields to help us understand what we don't know and to help us reconsider what we think we already do. That collective pursuit of knowledge is what enables us to do our jobs as academics, to create a little more certainty in the world, and to give students the tools to navigate the uncertainty that remains. In the first seminar in this series, Willis Deloney emphasized the importance of developing what he called a vocabulary that gives us the tools, each in our own discipline, to react to situations that we can't anticipate. Emily Elliott explained how changing the way we research and publish might better prepare us for outcomes that we don't expect. And John Poyman drilled into the concept of chaos, reminding us that events can be non-random, but also non-periodical, deterministic, and exquisitely sensitive to initial conditions. We have a distinguished panel of speakers today for a new set of observations about the nature of uncertainty in our world. I will introduce each of them before they speak, and I would like you to feel free to post questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom. You'll notice that the chat itself is disabled. So as soon as you have a question, feel free to post that in there. We will accumulate those questions as we go. And then once all the speakers have made their comments, we will open it up and start posing the questions to them. Please do identify yourself. If you're an LSU student, we'd like to give priority to those queries as they come in. Our first speaker is Gabriela González, a professor of physics and astronomy, searching for gravitational waves with the LIGO team. She has received awards from the American Physical Society, the American Astronomical Society, and the National Academy of Sciences, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and both the US and the Argentinian National Academies of Sciences. As a spokesperson for the LIGO team here in Louisiana, she participated in the announcement of the discovery of gravitational waves in 2016, which increased our certainty about the nature of the universe. Professor González.
Thank you, Aaron. And thank you to all of you who are attending and coming to listen to this in these uncertain times. So I wanted to talk about uncertainty in physics, which might sound like an oxymoron, but it's not. People think that physics is one of those hard sciences like math, right? 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. There's no doubt about that. And physics discoveries are real or not. Well, it's not quite like that. And I wanted to give you some examples. So let me share my screen. And I wanted to talk about two physics discoveries that have been named, and I think there is almost no discussion about this, about the discoveries of the last decade. I'm not saying century, the last decade. And those were both of these received the Nobel Prize in 2013 about the discovery of the Higgs particle in 2012, and the discovery of gravitational waves announced in 2016 that merited the Nobel Prize in 2017. I should mention that like Aaron said, I am a member of the LIGO collaboration, and I am very proud that the Academy recognized in this Nobel Prize as affiliations of Professors Weiss, Barish, and Kip Thorne, all good collaborators from MIT and Caltech, but they offered us their affiliations, LIGO Virgo collaboration, because these discoveries are teamwork. They are now in modern physics. There's no more a single scientist in a laboratory. There are just big teams. But I also wanted to tell you about the non-discovery, how some discoveries go away. That would have been another Nobel Prize, but it wasn't. So let me tell you about first the Higgs particle. I don't know how many of you were old enough in 2012. That wasn't that long ago. It was this past decade, but on July 4th, 2012, there was a big, it wasn't a press conference, it was a presentation, two presentations in a scientific conference in CERN, in the CERN auditorium in Geneva. And they presented results of two different experiments that had seen, not hints, they had announced hints months before this presentation, but in July they announced a big signal that they called the discovery of the Higgs particle. That was a new particle that had been predicted by a model there is in physics, something that we call the standard model. It's a standard model for atomic and electromagnetic forces. It's a beautiful model. It predicts lots of things. It predicted this particle as the origin of all the other particles, like photons and electrons and all the other particles, from this Higgs particle that could only be seen at a very high energy. I remember this because I wanted, they had announced that this was going to be streamed. This was 2012. We were not used to Zoom. There was no live streaming as common as it is now, but they were live streaming this conference and we all wanted to be there and we couldn't because it was full. But there were people tweeting already in live putting pictures of the slides as they were presented. So what was the discovery? I'm not going to talk about the physics of the discovery. I'm going to talk about the how do we know it was a discovery? Well, there were two experiments, and that was very important. Both of these experiments have big machines called, one is Atlas and another is CMS, in this Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, which is an international collaboration that also includes, well, two collaborations that also include the US. And these are pictures of that scientific conference where they presented the slides and the results. Fabiola Gianotti, she was at the time the spokesperson of the Atlas experiment, and she was presenting some of these results in there. She's now the director of CERN. But this is a fine print. In physics, when we hear about discoveries, we want to look at the paper. We want to look at the data. The data is usually very messy, so unless you are working in that, it's very difficult to analyze. But we look at the paper, we look at the abstract, and the abstract is very technical too, but here I have highlighted the keywords. There were two papers from these two experiments, different experiments, but trying to measure the same thing. The same thing are these explosions that are analyzed in terms of particles, that can be other things too. And what they say is that there was an excess of events observed about the expected background. So in general, in physics experiments, we have something that we call background, which are all those other things that we are not looking for. And they might be hiding what we are looking for. And as we make the instruments more and more sensitive, then the signals we are looking for rise above that background, but there is still uncertainty. And we need to measure how uncertainty, and the way we usually measure it is in terms of sigmas or standard deviations. So if you read scientific articles, you might have heard about 5 sigma being the gold standard. 5 sigma means that the probability of this excess being due to a random fluctuation is only a part in a few million. So that's like very, very sensitive, right? Well, I'll tell you about the non-discovery later. But here, it wasn't only that it was 5 sigma, it was that it was 5 sigma and 6 sigma in these two different experiments that they measured some properties like the energy of this particle, 125 GeV, no matter what GeV is, a unit of energy, and 126 GeV. So having two experiments corroborating each other was what gave us so much confidence. This paper was not published before the announcement. It was published only a month later, but there is a discussion on whether there needs to be data that's peer-reviewed before announcements or after announcements. And that is something that goes on in physics collaborations and in physics experiments a lot. So let me tell you about another discovery that did not get a Nobel Prize, but also got a first page in the New York Times and in many, many papers around the world. It didn't get the photograph. Usually, whether you have a photograph with a science experiment depends on how nice the image is. And there was a nice image with this discovery. This was space ripples, gravitational waves that were revealing the inflation of the universe. These were the imprint of gravitational waves from the very early universe, and that was the proof of inflation, which is a theory that in physics and astronomy we do believe a lot. We know that the universe is expanding, but there are a lot of things that are better explained if the universe in the early times is expanding exponentially fast, and that's what we call inflation. That was proposed by Dr. Guth. He's usually claimed as the inventor of inflation long time ago in the 70s. And he was contacted before this announcement, which was done in a press conference. Again, it was a 5 sigma announcement. Dr. Kovac, the PI of this experiment that was called BICEP 2, said that the chance of these results was only 1 in 10 million, that 5 sigma standard. I was saying that I missed seeing that photograph in the paper. I remember where I was when this was announced, and I was almost crying of emotion looking at this discovery. It was beautiful, except that it wasn't. This is the paper, and the paper appeared quite a bit later. This announcement was done in March. This was March 2014. This paper was published June 2014, so a few months later. And when you read it, it's after being peer reviewed, and this also tells you, sometimes looking at these dates, you can tell how long it went through peer review. And they say we find an excess of what they were looking for, the imprint of these gravitational waves, which is inconsistent with a null hypothesis, meaning it could be a fluke, at a significance larger than 5 sigma, the magic number. But if you keep reading, they say, however, these models are not sufficiently constrained by external public data to exclude the possibility of dust emission bright enough to explain the entire excess signal. That is, the imprint of gravitational waves on the measurement they were making could also be produced by dust. And this was something that was being done, not such a nice measurement of this particular signal, the B mode, but a very good measure of the cosmic microwave background and the effect on dust on that was being done by a European experiment, a European space experiment called Planck, also with a collaboration, the Planck collaboration. And they had not made their data public. They had not published the data yet. So there couldn't be very good estimates of whether this was dust or signal. And unfortunately, as you might suspect, it was dust. So this was the New York Times again, later saying the speck of interstellar dust obscures the glimpse of the Big Bang. And this beautiful drawing that looks like a Van Gogh picture is actually a measurement of the effect of dust, which is very similar to the effect, what would be the effect of gravitational waves. So it was a 5 sigma, but it didn't prove that the signal they were measuring was from gravitational waves. It was from dust. It was an excess, but it was due to something else. And this is how science works. It needs corroboration, it needs time. And now we don't doubt that the electron exists, but the discovery of the electron was very uncertain at the time it was done. The certainty builds up with time. And finally, the last experiment, of course, is gravitational waves. This, I was very proud to be part of the announcement in a press conference in the National Science Foundation, but we had all this background in our minds and other known discoveries that had been made. So the signal was detected in the 2 gravitational wave detectors, the one here in Livingston, Louisiana, and the other detector in Hanford, Washington. And we had seen this very strong signal, but we needed to be certain. We needed to be more sure. We needed to build up our knowledge of the background to understand whether this was a fluke or not. So we took our time in announcing it. And in fact, we sent our paper for peer review, and it appeared in press at the same time that we did the announcement. And this is what we said. 5 sigma again, the false alarm rate estimate. We like to say, because this was one event, one astrophysical event, we can't repeat the experiment. So we like to say how often this can happen by chance. And it was once per 200,000 years. And that's equivalent to the 5 sigma in these other experiments. But moreover, we could also tell from the signal, this is a signal, the coincidence, this imprint of these gravitational waves as light in a photodetector. 2 detectors that were 3,000 kilometers away detected the same thing. That was the sine wave that was measuring the dance of 2 black holes that were merging and ended up together. Ray Wise and Kip Thorne were the Nobel Prize recipients I showed you before in the cover in the next year in 2017. I want to say that this was done again. The publication was by the LIGO scientific collaboration and the Virgo collaboration, because we had been working together already with a European collaboration that didn't have their detectors ready, but they did in 2017 when we made another bigger discovery. But I want to say that Louisiana was very well represented in here, not just because of my LSU pin in that press conference. We are one of more than 100 institutions as part of that collaboration. But the two people who were working on the detectors that night, because it was during the very early morning hours, it was dark still. It was had a bachelor's from LSU. She worked in our group, Natsuni, and William Parker, who is a graduate of Southern University. So Louisiana, we feel very, very proud of this for many different reasons. And also, I can't help you but finish this showing you the first pages of the newspaper that don't talk about the uncertainty. So my message is go and look at what's behind the discoveries. The titles were all amazing. We can hear the universe in the Advocate. We were very proud that we were above the fold, even though there was a big crowd in Baton Rouge going to see Trump, who was a candidate then. But here we were in the New York Times with a faint chirp: scientists prove Einstein correct. We never doubted Einstein was correct. As a proof of general relativity, this is not a very good proof. But that's what's picked up in the newspaper. I have to say that there were other covers in other papers that I liked better than these two. And I also can't resist by showing you that me being from Argentina and being in that press conference was picked up by Argentinian newspapers. So this was a picture in the Argentinian newspaper, not so much about the announcement, but about an Argentinian being in that historic announcement. So again, my message here is physics is not so cut and dry. It's not that we have it and then we know we have it. We really need to work at these discoveries, and sometimes they go away. I gave you one example. There are many more examples. And most of these other examples also appear in the papers. There was that first page on that BICEP 2 early universe gravitational waves announcements. The fact that it wasn't a discovery, that was in the science section in page 8 of the same paper. So you have to have healthy skepticism about all discoveries, being those medical or physics, until they are proven right by replication, corroboration, and time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Gabby. That was terrific. And it gives us lots, I think, to talk about in terms of how we know what we know and when and everything else. All right. Our next speaker is going to be Len Apcar. Len joined LSU's Manship School of Mass Communication in 2015 after nearly 40 years as a reporter and editor, first for the Wall Street Journal and later for the New York Times. He has been a reporter, a web editor, the Washington editor, the Asia editor, and a Page One editor. At LSU, he holds the Wendell Gray Switzer Jr. Endowed Chair in Media Literacy. He teaches writing, reporting, media management, and a special class on media manipulation and fake news. Len. We got to unmute you there.
Here we go. Thank you. I'm delighted that a distinguished physics professor teed up everything I need to say about journalism and front page of newspapers. So thank you very much. I didn't know what to expect following such a prominent scholar as Gabriela González. I thought, well, a newspaper guy following her, this is gonna be crazy. But Thank you. It was very good to see those newspapers and to see that newspapers validate scientific discovery, even if they get it a little wrong. Or not quite wrong, but even if they get it in a way that popularizes a scientific discovery, and somehow, as you say, confirms our belief in Einstein, even though it was never really in question. So with that, I want to take you to a slide, if I could, of a photograph, and begin here. Now, this is a newsstand in New York City. I'm going to focus on uncertainty about what we read, and I'm going to also focus on uncertainty in the news landscape. We have a lot to cover. So I'll start just with this image, just to kind of set the scene. This is a real newsstand on a real street. It happens to be 42nd Street in New York. And if you know Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan, well, this is right behind the main New York Public Library near Bryant Park. And about, I think it was in 2018, the Columbia Journalism Review did an experiment, took over this newsstand with the help of some private funders, and they left the soda and candy for real there, and all the publications resemble real publications like New York Magazine or The Economist or some out-of-town newspapers. And they put on them stories that were completely fake. Completely fake. Everything you see there that looks like printed material are fake stories, real fake stories that circulated on the internet, if there is such a thing as a real fake story. And they stood back and they watched, various observers watched to see what busy New Yorkers, other visitors what their reaction might be as they walked by the kiosk, browsed, picked up a cup of coffee, a candy bar, bag of chips. Nobody was surprised by the headlines. What were some of the headlines? Here's one: Texas now recognized as a Mexican state. Here's another: painkillers in our water supply. It was on a cover of a publication that resembled The Economist. The Texas Mexico State one resembled New York Magazine. So the point of this is that the reaction was so muted. We are so inured to distorted material, tabloid headlines, crazy stuff that we might see in a supermarket checkout line. It doesn't faze us when a whole newsstand is taken over with fake, manipulated material. And this went on all day. It was a recorded experiment, and the Columbia Journalism Review wrote about it. What we find, you can take the slide down now, what we find now is that by shining a light on falsehoods, actually, particularly with the power and speed of social media, that disinformation becomes more real and much more widespread. I'll give you another example. Shortly after the 2016 election, we invited a great fake news author here to LSU, and he came down in April of 2017, Cameron Harris. Cameron Harris had been on the front page of the New York Times a few months earlier. And what Cameron Harris did is he sat down one night in the heat of the 2016 election, where Trump was saying that Hillary Clinton was going to cheat. She couldn't win unless she cheated. And he watched polling data during the 2016 debates move sentiment that the election was rigged and Hillary Clinton was a cheater. So he sat down and experimented with something. And he wrote a story, completely made up in his own head on his kitchen table. He wrote a story that said, there is a warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, full of absentee ballots pre-marked for Hillary Clinton. Ohio was a battleground state. Stacks of ballots were in this warehouse. He put the address, the intersection of what block it was on. And he said, follow this story. It's developing. There'll be more developments as it comes along. Ballots pre-marked Hillary Clinton, Ohio. He had bought himself a URL for this for $5, sent it out, and it went viral very quickly, right? The Ohio authorities immediately knocked it down the next morning. It was pretty easy to knock down. There was no such thing as ballots pre-marked, they're absentee or otherwise. They were not in a warehouse. And the state and county officials completely denied it, said it was not true. And guess what? It went further. It went further. The fake news, the manipulation of it just soared, and 6 million impressions were created from Cameron Harris's fake story. And this always impresses my students. Google News picked it up. Google puts ads randomly on news articles like that. He made over $20,000 in 24 hours. $20,000. He was a new graduate of Davidson College, by the way, which was not at all happy with him. And he paid off some loans, and he came to LSU to talk about it. And he came to LSU to talk about it. Frankly, he said, because we need to talk about not the fact I did it, but how easy it was. And we spent a lot of time with Cameron. He talked talked to classes. He spoke publicly here in the community, packed one of the centers over on this side of campus where the Manship School is. How do we counter this in our information flow? I tell students, I'm going to fast forward now to last week. I tell my students, and I have for years, if I give you nothing else in my classes, I want to give you a life skill for critically thinking and evaluating information, particularly newspaper journalism and web information, right? Does the information come from an independent source? Are there multiple sources? Are they verifiable? Can you go check out that this is actually true? Is it authoritative? Are the people who are quoted in this story really informed? Do they know what they're talking about? And are they numerous? And to make this really simple, we call this I am vain. Students like that. I am vain. I am V-A-I-N. And we even have a card. You can get these pretty much all over campus, but certainly at the Honors College where I was teaching last semester, and at the Manship School, they fit in your wallet. And it can remind you how to think about these particular stories. Now, that's not in any way a cure-all, far from it. It just asks students to think about the sensibilities of how to look at information today and how to judge it. Now, just last week, there was a story in The Advocate, our local website and newspaper, about our former football coach, Les Miles. It said that he had settled secretly some kind of sexual harassment dispute. It had no sources that were named. It said there were 3. So in that particular case, were they independent? We don't know. Were they multiple? Only because they said there were 3, we had to trust the writer in The Advocate. Was it verifiable? No. In fact, the article said that if you went into the database of court cases filed in courts in Baton Rouge, there was no sign of this case or the settlement. Was it authoritative? Did these people know what they were talking about? No way to know. Were they informed? Still no way to know. And nobody was named except Les Miles and his lawyer. It turned out that story, as we now know, was true. We still don't know who was involved. Les Miles asked for the report that was done on the settlement to come forward. It came forward, it was publicized. And one LSU official, former official, an aggrieved former official, by the way, called up to The Advocate and said, I remember this case, I remember this settlement, and I'll talk about it on the record. And The Advocate wrote a story about it. That was the first sign that there was something really to this. And Les Miles was denying it. My point here is that for a generation, a century really, we've had to trust certain kinds of branded information. And we can no longer do that. And so we have to, and this is the point I try to make to students and groups I talk to, we have to be our own editors. We have to think about stories like this in our own terms. Could The Advocate have gotten it wrong? According to Les Miles' lawyer, he was saying, this is speculative. We want to get the report out because we want to set the record straight, that kind of thing. We all wondered, well, did The Advocate get it wrong? It turned out it didn't get it wrong. it really didn't get it wrong at all. Although there's some facts in that case that we will never really know what happened between the student and the football coach. How does this information flow through our society, right? What is social media's role now? Well, it's like a linear accelerator, to use a physics term. I mean, it has moved things faster than the speed of light. The old Mark Twain quote about, a lie gets around the world faster than you can put your shoes on or pants on or whatever it is all very, very true. And Cameron Harris, showed in his case that not only can you knock down the lie, deny it, it just keeps going. We tend to like conspiracy theories. In that particular case, back to Hillary Clinton and the rigged election, the idea of a rigged election, people wanted to believe that. It was part of a way in which it confirms our biases. And that is a big part of the way information moves through society. We don't have time to go through information cascades and other social sciences that sociologists talk about, but it's very, very true about how rumors move through society and how we think about it and pass on information, all with the convenience of a like button on Facebook. What happened to objectivity? Objectivity, it was once a concept of social science, came about in the great scientific Enlightenment era in the late 1800s, 19th century. It was adopted as a business model by journalists and journalism and publishers. And it still is there, but it is overpowered by what's happened in the news ecosystem and in the news landscape, which has created the kind of uncertainty I want to kind of talk about now in terms of the landscape that we're now presented with. I don't have any real answers to this. A lot of people are working on it. Maybe we will come up with one today. That would be fabulous if it was true. But let me just give you a sense of what's happened here. In the last 15 years, right, more than a quarter of the newspapers in this country have closed. 15 years, they've closed. 1,800 communities that had a local news outlet no longer have one. And by the way, some of these are in Louisiana. I'm going to focus a little bit about, I'm going to talk a little bit about the numbers for a second more. Just in the last year, 36,000 reporters and editors, 36,000 have lost their jobs, had their pay cut, or were furloughed. The result is really familiar, right? A smaller staff is producing a thinner product, which attracts fewer customers and depriving a community of a basic service. You can go into northern Louisiana now, and you can count on one hand the number of reporters between a large city like Shreveport and a not so tiny city like Monroe. Who's going to the planning commission meeting? Who's going to the city council meeting? They're trying to do as much as they can, but there's not enough infrastructure, enough boots on the ground, if you will, to cover these things. So the business is having to restructure, and that creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty, not just for the publishers and the people who are employed or may be laid off right now, but it creates a lot of uncertainty for us because information is fundamental to a functioning democracy. We've known that for a long, long time. And while there's been a war on the media and truth for the last several years, the fact is that you need to have some source of information to confirm growth, progress, direction, scientific discovery, and policy in our society. So let's just talk a little bit about the ecosystem as we know it right here in our neighborhood. If the Advocate were to stop printing a paper this year, just stop it, no paper, therefore no advertising, no subscription revenue, it could not support its very good news operation and news gathering operation on digital subscriptions, right? Not now anyway. without local newsrooms doing that basic reporting, gathering accurate information, looking at public meetings, demanding transparency and the like, right? All of these interests, all these private interests can flourish without scrutiny and oversight. One of the gaps that have been filled by this has been LSU, which has started a news service to service 50 news outlets just in Louisiana, covering the state government, particularly when the legislature is in session. We do this through the Manship School. One of the things we've learned is that as the newspapers shrink, right, and our local paper just disappears completely, our own scholarship here at LSU, Josh Dar in political science and the Manship School, Joanna Dunaway, who was here, is now at Texas A&M. They looked at what happens when there is a lack of information and how we vote. And what they found was that people tend to polarize even more. They can't trust bipartisan information. And so they say, well, I'm conservative, I'll just vote the straight conservative line because I don't really have much information about the other side or the other side of the issue. That was a 2018 piece of scholarship. University of Illinois and Notre Dame put out a piece of scholarship that says when public meetings are not scrutinized, not covered, not looked at, you can track data that shows that the cost of government rises, wages, taxes, and the like. So what are the options here? Some options are that for-profit newspapers convert to nonprofit or not for-profit operations. Very few cases have emerged so far, but a lot of people think it may be the right answer in certain communities. The most prominent legacy media brand who's done this is the Salt Lake Tribune, which converted to a 501c3. It is nonpartisan. It makes no political endorsements, and it's strictly it's open for subscriptions, it's open for advertisements, and it's open for donations and philanthropic support from foundations and wealthy donors. There are other examples of that. Not all of them are 501c3s. The Philadelphia Inquirer is a larger market newspaper that has also gone to a not-for-profit model, but not in a 501c3 model. So people might argue, well, so what if they all die? Well, we've just told you what the so what is in terms of societal information and policy. And won't market forces be such that that others will come in to fill a void? And the answer is they might. In fact, there is a startup here in New Orleans. It's also involved here in Baton Rouge called the Louisiana Illuminator. It's a group of some picayune folks who have decided to start up a newspaper, a website, web only, and are trying to do this on a not-for-profit basis. And that may be part of the answer. But the uncertainty is that we don't know what the answer is or what the outcome will be for the advocate or for the illuminator. And I'll stop there because that's essentially where we are right now in the kind of the news eco landscape.
Great, thank you, Len. You're right. Gabby and you, I think, are on a very similar page here in terms of how we know and how we think about what we know. And I hope that we've got questions that will help, or maybe just suggestions for solving some of the problems you laid out. Our last speaker today is Michelle Zerba, who is the Maggie B. Martin Professor of Rhetoric and Classical Studies and has a split appointment in the departments of English and foreign languages here at LSU. Her research and teaching spans the fields of classical literature and philosophy, Renaissance drama, and political theory and classical reception. She has held grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, and the Partnership University Fund of the French government. Her most recent publications include the book Modern Odysseys, Reading Homer with C.P. Cavafy, Virginia Woolf, and Aimé Césaire, and the Norton Critical Edition of Aristotle's Poetics. Michelle.
Hello, everyone. So my talk today bears a somewhat different title than the one that was circulated, though I'm going to be talking about more or less the same subject, and that is uncertainty at the intersection of ancient skepticism and modern neuroscience. I'm going to be offering some food for thought about the intriguing ways in which Greek antiquity continues to live with us and speak to us in our contemporary world. And in the process, I hope to continue making the case for the vital importance of keeping the past and present alive in a conversation that can enrich us from multiple sides. In a New Yorker cartoon, two kids are sitting in an armchair talking, and one says to the other, "First they make you put on your own shirt, then they make you tie your own shoes. You gotta ask yourself, where's this all heading?" The cartoon imagines childhood as a state of willfully resisting the inevitable, that each of us will one day have to tie our own shoes. This dawning realization elicits incredulity and a conspiratorial sense of adults. What are they up to? But we don't have to be children to feel this way. If we don't get certainty, we may go to some lengths to engineer it for ourselves. In that case, we may become like one of the sheep on the hill in the second cartoon who looks downhill and remarks, "I've never trusted cows." Or we may find ourselves in need of a medicine like the one in this third cartoon, which advertises a drug named Dogmaril, which boosts rigid thought patterns for a wide range of belief systems and reduces independent thinking by up to 60%. These cartoons lead me to my first point today. Neuroscience has found that uncertainty is considerably more stressful for humans than even negative consequences when those consequences are predictable. Waiting for certainty is akin to death by 1,000 cuts. The principle of entropy has been brought to bear on this phenomenon. Self-organizing biological organisms resist disorder. Our cognitive systems strive to reduce uncertainty because dealing with it requires cerebral energy. If our brains can't find effective ways of coping with uncertainty, a neurochemical crisis can develop that is potentially toxic, as this slide illustrates. In popular lingo, we refer to such toxicity as nervous wear and tear. It can lead to a variety of psychic ailments, including anxiety, panic, depression, and a myriad of associated physical ills that have long tormented humans. Scientists have termed this toxic imbalance allostatic load. Allostasis is the term used of the brain's effective adaptation to a stressor. Allostatic load, by contrast, is the term for the cost of chronic exposure to elevated endocrine and neural responses resulting from challenges that the individual experiences as stressful. If an abundance of uncertainty can induce psychic wear and tear, then what are the ways of reducing the potential toxicity? The ancient Greeks, I think, were tuned into this psychodynamic complex of uncertainty. They didn't have our science 2.5 millennia ago, but a loosely associated group of philosophers developed an entire way of life for coping with such stress. These were the skeptics, whose name means inquirers or seekers. And the most famous of these was Pyrrho of Elis, who lived in the 4th to the 3rd century BCE. His bust is here in the upper right-hand corner. He actually traveled with Alexander the Great on his conquest of the East, as pictured on this map. And he went as far as India, where he met the Indian gymnosophists and the Magi. From him, we get the name for the oldest branch of skepticism, known as Pyrrhonism. Now, it's not coincidental that the impetus for skepticism has roots in travel, exposure to foreign lands, and alternative religions. Skepticism, in fact, deals with multiplicity, divergence, and disagreement. Its earliest manifestations are, in fact, in the Odyssey, that great epic of journey and contact with the other. Piero's exposure to Eastern thought inspired his philosophy, and it's stimulated new work on the connections between ancient skepticism and early Buddhism, especially regarding certainty and what they called freedom from worry. While Piero himself wrote nothing, the philosophy he inspired was set down in a work entitled The Outlines of Pyrrhonism by a medical doctor of the 2nd to 3rd century CE named Sextus Empiricus, who was also pictured on this slide. Now, if the Odyssey is one of the ancient inspirations for Pyrrhonist skepticism, so is another Greek figure that some of you are probably already thinking about, and that is Socrates. His question and answer technique made him a forebear of the skeptics' inquiring ways. Actually, the skeptics came on the scene not only after Socrates, but after major philosophical schools, namely the Platonists, the Aristotelians, the Stoics, the Epicureans, were already vying for first place in the marketplace of ideas. And this is really important. The historical position of the skeptics, their belatedness, allowed them to survey a combative field of experts who did not agree on fundamental questions about truth and knowledge. Rather than elevating one authority over another or developing their own settled notions, they interrogated beliefs and claims to knowledge, and in the end, seeing uncertainty in every position, they refrained from claiming what was true and continued the search. For this reason, the skeptics also called themselves not only inquiring, but aporetic. That is, they entertained conflicting impressions and beliefs without advancing ultimate truth claims. They didn't say we can't attain knowledge, that would be negative dogmatism, as they called it, but only that in this instance, we don't appear to have it, and thus we persist in investigating. Now, this brings me to my third point. The skeptical posture is engaged, inquiring, and open to competing views. It leads to what the skeptics called suspension of belief, or epoche. That is the practice of weighing and assessing conflicting experiences and truth claims while refraining from assent or denial. Provisional acknowledgement of a seemingly superior belief may be possible for the skeptic, but she will typically qualify it with such phrases as perhaps, or it appears, or it may be. Now we come to the heart of the matter. Suspension of belief is said to give way to tranquility, a word that translates the Greek ataraxia. Tranquility for the skeptic comes as a consequence of epoche, of suspending belief. It does not come from giving up the pursuit of truth, but rather by giving up the expectation that we must acquire truth in order to get tranquility. So it's the intense striving for certainty that is psychically disruptive, they thought. It leads to anxiety, unhealthy attachments, and delusional claims to knowledge. Suspension of belief, by contrast, is conducive to ataraxia, freedom from worry. Now, the skeptics, in short, meet certain uncertainty by cultivating uncertainty. And in doing so, they foster a psychic condition that appears conducive to health. The good life for them is lived by adapting ourselves to a world of constant change, by moving with rather than against unpredictability. Now, the skeptical complex that links uncertainty with mental agility and coolness has been used in advertising. As we can see on the slide, consider the computer company Linux on the right, which deals in open source operating systems. The company wants to think of the multi-platform ataraxia, Linux, in terms of hip adaptability in traveling the cosmos. Its design is simple, compact, portable, and it leaves us free from worry. But speaking of hip adaptability, jazz has been studied from the perspective of uncertainty, as we saw in Willis Deloney's talk a couple of weeks ago. More than one critic has spoken of Miles Davis jazz compositions, notably the famous one cited on this page, in terms of creative uncertainty, a poised capacity to improvise, a freedom from care, hence the title, So What? That's the jazz composition. So how is belief brought to suspension? For the skeptics, by interrogating experiences and beliefs via what they call the skeptical modes, and observing how disagreement and divergence arises. There are different formulation of the modes in skepticism, and here are a few so you can get a taste for how they went about suspending belief. The same objects cannot, or excuse me, the same objects can appear different owing to circumstances, conditions, or dispositions. One mode. A second mode. The same objects can appear different based on positions, distances, and locations. Another mode. Since no object strikes the senses entirely by itself, but along with something else, we would not be able to say what the object is like by itself. Now, all of this sounds vaguely postmodern, perhaps, but actually it lies at the very early stages of Western philosophical reflection. Fluctuations in the subject and the object, and the very breakdown of this distinction between subject and object, like does it really exist, can occur under scrutiny from the skeptical modes. So let me give you an example from Sextus Empiricus that shows how this works. This is a kind of loose translation in English of a passage from Greek. And this is what he illustrates how a skeptic in the Pyrrhonist school might respond. When someone asserts an argument we cannot refute, we say, before the founder of the school to which you adhere was born, the argument of the school, which may be sound, was not yet apparent. Although it may have been there in nature. It's possible that the argument opposing the one you have just asserted is really there in nature, but not yet apparent. So we should not assent to what now seems a powerful argument. Another argument that will one day appear just as strong will defeat it. So this is an example of the way in which this kind of argumentation might work. Now, I'm going to give you something that is a little bit less philosophically technical by going to a famous figure in Homer's Odyssey, Penelope. I've already indicated that the Odyssey is a forebear of skepticism, and this is a kind of non-philosophical illustration of suspended belief. So many of you are familiar with the figure of Penelope, who's pictured in three evocative images on this slide. Stranded in Ithaca for 20 years while she awaits a husband who may never return, Penelope is pressed to make a decision about remarriage. In these circumstances, she devises a trick. She tells the suitors who have overrun the palace that she will remarry when she finishes weaving a shroud for Laertes, who is the aged father of Odysseus. Instead, she weaves by day and unweaves by night, postponing a decision that would close the question about her husband's return and prematurely end her search. She weaves and unweaves. Homer tells us she would neither refuse remarriage nor would she bring it about. Effectively, she suspends belief in the face of contradictory appearances. In a world of uncertainty, she seeks to keep the inquiry open. Now, the Odyssey admires Penelope for this. It connects her wariness with survival and pressing circumstances and mental agility, a mental agility that keeps her from going off the deep end. That quality, mental agility, actually has a special name in the Odyssey. It's called metis. It's that improvisational spark, the spontaneous flash of brilliance that works with rather than fighting against uncertainty. Now, in the last couple of slides, I want to close with a few questions about creative uncertainty, suspending belief, and mental agility. Neuroscience is opening new doors into what the ancients called psychic turmoil. Increasingly, mood disorders are being linked to malfunctions in the so-called default mode network, which has been called the brain's center of gravity. It's pictured here in an fMRI scan. The default mode network is a large-scale brain network that's active when a person is in a restful waking state. It engages in activities like self-reflection, autobiographical memory, planning for the future, and emotional self-processing. So the default mode network, or DMN, is associated with the construct that we call the self. They're locating, as it were, the self in the brain, and with the narrative structure through which we create a sense of personal identity over time. Because uncertainty is one of the brain's greatest challenges, the default mode network enables prediction, coding, and a sense that the world is essentially navigable because it's foreseeable. Evidence is mounting that mood disorders may be related to what has been called a hyperactive DMN. The brain can become dysfunctionally set within neural pathways of predictability. So mood disorders register a diminished capacity of the DMN to regulate downward in conditions of heightened uncertainty, an inability to become less self-referential, less bound up with mental tapes about the self. In other words, the DMN can trap us into toxic self-absorption. The center of the gravity of the brain does not serve us well when its pathways become so rigid that uncertainty poses an enormous threat. So that leads to the last comments on this slide, that along with studies and pathologies associated with the DMN are studies in what's being called divergent thinking. This is a term that is being used in neuroscience to discuss, to identify the ability to see the world from multiple directions, to entertain competing views, and to find alternative solutions to problems. Cognitive flexibility, adaptability, and creativity have been associated with divergent thinking. Studies are pointing in an interesting direction. Divergent thinking combines different networks in the brain that typically don't get activated at the same time. So divergent thinking, in other words, involves the co-activation of brain networks that usually work separately. It takes us out of the heavily worn grooves of the default mode by making it operate in tandem with less tracked networks that you see on the slide. Notably, what's called the executive control network that comes into play when we try to assess whether that wild thought or that harebrained idea might actually work. That's the executive network that comes into play. And the salience network that acts as a kind of switching mechanism between the default mode and the executive control network. So these are the questions I want to ask. Is it worth asking whether the techniques of the ancient skeptics, whose way of life is what we might call divergent adept, and whose practices enabled ataraxia, provide a psychic balancing act for which neuroscience is now generating evidence? Is it worth connecting ancient ways of dealing with problems that had a different vocabulary with new studies in neuroscience. Does suspended belief, related as it is to the energetic consideration of competing views, facilitate healthy departures from default mode? I think this connects up with both what Len and Gabby have been saying in a somewhat different vein. Might ataraxia have a neurochemistry that is related to cognitive flexibility cultivated by the ancient skeptics? And is the link between Pyrrhonism and early Buddhism worth considering in light of the freedom from worry that neuroscience aligns positively with what they call allostasis? So these are some of the questions that lead us to ponder how, at the intersection of the ancient and the modern, we may come to a new understanding both of the pathologies that afflict us and the therapeutic practices that might free us. And on that note, I'm gonna exit here from the screen share.
Great, thank you, Michelle. We did not coordinate these talks. We didn't really even talk about how we were going to do other than the order, but it still strikes me somewhat remarkable how well they fit together. And one of the links here, I was thrilled to see you give us a kind of deep dive into skepticism, because it seems to me that in some ways Gabby was talking about skepticism and Len was talking about cynicism, and you were talking about how you find a balance point. And so there's probably questions there. We already have one question that has come in from a student, and so I'm going to go ahead and pose this one to Len, and then we'll move on as we go here. Robert Powers asks, is there any research out there that suggests ways to effectively combat fake news? You, Dr. Apcar, mentioned that combating fake news online often only makes it more popular. So what are some strategies for responding to this, probably both online and offline? You're muted now, Len. Let's make sure we've...
The research shows that the more you deny, the faster it goes around the world. And what often happens is that the error gets repeated itself, and that confuses people. And so the only real cure-all, frankly, is for somebody to come in and explain what happened, and it's usually way after the fact. I think, frankly, one of the good things that's happened in the last 4 years as this problem has surfaced is that a lot of our students, frankly, a lot of the younger people have left Facebook, and they're on other forms of social media, and they're only on Facebook because their grandparents are on it or their parents are on it, and they don't use it as a communicating device. In most of my classes, I rarely see a student on Facebook anymore. And I think that started to happen when they got wise to Facebook's business model and how their content was being taken and monetized to advertisers. And I think it also happened when they realized that they were in a bubble and they were sharing nonsense. They could be sharing nonsense, and they didn't want to do that. Or at least a lot of them didn't want to do it, or they wanted to be a little more skeptical. So the short answer is no. There's no device, and even the platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, have tried to hire armies of people to weed this out, and even that's only slowed it slightly. It has not stopped it.
At a secondary level, another person asked, sort of connected to that, about publications that claim to use the language of "I'm vain," but are in fact using that as a kind of shield, and still propagating false narratives. And this was a friend asking for a friend. Is there sort of a way to push through that? Is there a kind of second level of critical apparatus that we can use beyond the one, that useful one that we will remember the.
Well, I'll tell you, there actually is a cool tool that here at LSU, I've tried to get the university to promote this and think about this, but one professor at the Manship School has not been successful, me. If you are a Turnitin campus, and if you're, which we are, there is a product for free. Normally it's a subscription product called NewsGuard. You can attach it to your browsers. There is a code that LSU has it. There's a code, and we could all put this on our Chrome or Firefox, whatever you want. And when you do search results, you get your results, and it puts up a rating, not by an algorithm, but by real people. And they've rated thousands of information sites for on a whole a long list of criteria that's completely transparent. But in the pandemic and all the burden that's been placed on the Faculty Technology Center and other places, I've just never been able to get the library or IT to promote this, and it's there. And my students use it. I give it out to students to try to get them to use it. It's another way of screening information. NewsGuard. It's a good it's a very good product, and it's free to LSU students. But so's the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and I don't have a lot of evidence that they're reading them.
Right. Michelle, I think this question is for you about whether you can provide divergent thinking exercises or techniques. And this is there's clearly a book to be written about taking the ancients and applying neuroscience and sort of modern. So somebody should be paying attention to this, I think. And anyway.
Yes, well, one of the things that occurs to me in thinking about that question is the very different context in which Gabby is working as a scientist in physics, and the way in which Len is working with primarily news through various media that are rapidly changing now. I think that one of the things that Len is dealing with is the problem that comes through massive, through viral forms of stories that are circulated that are simply not scrutinized. I've read on your webpage the kind of checklist that you have for how one might validate what a piece of fake news is. And one of the things you're doing is following along the lines of what Gabby and scientists do much more rigorously when they have to inquire into whether a discovery is in fact a discovery or a non-discovery. But I think that the answer to the question of how you practice divergent modes of thinking has a lot to do with context. I think that scientists are probably trained to do that. Maybe I'm wrong, Gabby. They're probably trained to do that by virtue of the way in which they both work collaboratively within groups that have to constantly test their hypotheses and their potential discoveries against each other. Whereas in platforms like Instagram and Twitter, you just have things going viral indiscriminately without any sort of stopping mechanisms. And I think that one of the challenges that we're facing now is something, I think in a sense, all of us in universities are teaching skepticism in a fashion. We want to develop students who are highly, capable of critical thought. We want to send them out into the world that way. And so in a sense, many of us teach students how to argue on both sides of a question and how to see a potential problem from multiple points of view. I would think that's the first exercise in divergent thinking, is that you listen as much as you can to alternative tales and you try to validate them somehow. Even if you don't come up with certainty, you're probably going to come up with a better version that might tentatively guide you into action. So I don't want to hold the floor here, but I want to say that the other problem that we are dealing with now that is related to divergent thinking, but almost on the opposite side, is just people are so incapable of it that they simply will fall in with a meme and more or less subscribe to a way of thinking that is based on a word clip that may not be scrutinized at all So I would welcome other answers from Gabby and from Len about that.
Yeah, Gabby, I wonder if I can amplify what she said and ask you, because one of the things that I sort of heard you saying, though you didn't use this word, was persistence. That, I mean, the timeline that you described is, I mean, the quote from the person who initially discovered said, well, I never thought in my lifetime I would see evidence for this. And as it turns out, he may not, because they had to retract the evidence. And so I wonder how, I mean, to what degree as you train scientists, you sort of prepare them to accept what could be decades or even longer. If we're just now proving Einstein from 1912, you've got to be very patient. And this is not a very patient world.
It was almost exactly the 100-year anniversary. He predicted gravitational waves in 1916. We announced them in 2016. Well, two answers. One is that these latest discoveries, the instruments that we use on the space, on the ground for the frontier science now, are so complex that they do take decades in building and understanding and producing results. But the instrument itself is made of a lot of small parts, and you need all these people to produce all these parts that work well together. So you don't train scientists to wait 20 or 30 or 50 years to see if they got it right. They know within a year, within a graduate student lifetime, not lifetime, but thesis time, thesis timeline, whether their work was useful, was relevant to the science or not. So discoveries take decades, but the instruments are built piece by piece. The science is made piece by piece, and it's making progress every year. Discoveries come a long time in the future, but progress is made every time, every year. But I also wanted to say that something that we do a lot in science, and it's sacred to us, is reproducibility. And of course, in medicine, it's even more. But in physics, like with an astrophysics discovery, you cannot make the black holes collide again, but you can see whether the same instrument detects similar events. And after that first detection, I have to say that we weren't sleeping very well until we saw the second certain detection. We have seen 50 by now, but reproducing a result is what makes experiments and theories go up or down. There have been many retractions because the experiment that was claimed in one study could not be reproduced. So I'm not sure how that applies to science or philosophy, because the arguments and the news stories are different. But the basic principle, I think, still applies. You want to see evidence that can be reproduced.
Well, that's certainly verification, corroboration in our business.
That's right.
And when you're investigating, and so much of when you're working with writers who are investigating, and even if you have data doesn't write itself into a story for us. I doubt it does in science either. But data can help you, but it also gives you an opening for a counter narrative, right? Okay, we see it like this, but what about this? Can we look at the possibility that this happened, as even though that could be supported by this data? And that happens more and more as we're more data driven in a lot of work that journalists do.
And I wanted to, maybe I can come in, Len, and say that that data have to be interpreted, and interpretation is always a matter of a cognitive frame that you bring to whatever the data are that you're studying. And so I think that that is another thing that argues for the importance of the sciences, especially in a university setting, being associated with humanistic disciplines, which study the art and the craft of interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
because in a sense, we're overloaded with data that we don't know how to interpret. We're entering into a stage of such data saturation that we really have to invent better ways for people to think about it. And of course,
that's exactly right. I mean, the non-discovery I presented was not saying the data was not true. It was saying it was dust and not gravitational waves.
exactly.
It was interpretation.
Yep.
I wonder, we had a question about skepticism and what seems to be a sort of gap between, I think, kind of academic or intellectual prioritization of skepticism and a popular threshold that's much, much lower, prone to adopt conspiracy thinking. And I wondered if any of you might want to comment on why that is. And I guess I connected this partly, Michelle, from your comment about oversaturation of data. If there's a point at which people say, there's too much to know, so I will sort of fall back on dogma. If that's an explanation, and I don't know if it is, but if others of you have seen that kind of gap, I mean, I would imagine in newsrooms, this is a kind of, the fact that an invented story can garner 6 million views has to sort of create a fair amount of frustration. What are our readers doing? Why aren't they more critical?
Well, the biggest concern we have, leave aside the fake news story, the biggest concern we have as a society, I think, is that people don't know what to believe, and so they drop out, to put it plainly. And when I first started thinking about media literacy, I thought this was a pretty far-fetched notion, but that was 5 years ago, and I think we're here. I think a lot of people tune out cable news. They fall into their bubbles, and they don't really have an independent source of news they trust. A lot of the big mainstream newspaper news outlets are in trouble, or they make big mistakes. The New York Times made a colossal one on its podcast Caliphate. It's made other mistakes lately. I was crossing my fingers because I like Andrea Gallo, and she's one of our alumna at the Advocate, that she got all this right with she was being sued by the Attorney General on that harassment case with the chief aide. She had discovered this Les Miles thing, that she had some corroboration with USA Today. But all you needed in that investigation was one big mistake, and she would have been crushed, frankly, by our institution, because they would not have taught any little error would have hurt the Advocate a lot, and just proven that they could not be trusted. And that's the kind of society that we're in. And so people then think, well, I'll just filter it out. I know what I think, and that's all I care about. And they'll develop their impressions however they want to develop them in terms of voting or the mayor or the city council or all the other things that we value as a way to govern our society. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's the biggest, that's frankly the uncertainty and the risk here. And I think in a deeply polarized society, or in a state like Louisiana that's tomato red, there are people who just don't read the news and don't want to read the news, and just have decided that if it's important enough, I'll get the information I need. And I don't think it's unique to our part of the world. I think it's frankly pervasive among our students.
So it seems to me that there are different ways of living with uncertainty, and you're describing one way in which perhaps a significant number of people do, and that is to tune out incoming sources of conflicting views because, well, if you go back to, a neuroscientific model, the default mode is the most comfortable mode that the brain works in. And it probably stops accepting a certain amount of influx at the point where it's radically destabilizing of your own sense of personhood. And I think that one of the things we're dealing right now, simply again at a technological level, is such a high amount of input that the degree and the kind of uncertainty is forcing people to shut down. I think that's a huge challenge to universities, because we are in the business of not letting that close down. That's what we're here to do. That defines our mission, that we don't let the people we teach close down those, cognitive inputs, and to develop a variety of ways of dealing with them effectively. So one of the things that comes with, I think, teaching many different perspectives is strategies for dealing with them. And you're discussing strategies that can work in kind of a mass comm environment. And Gabby is describing ways in which uncertainty works within the more controlled environments of science. But I think people in general, outside of those two different kind of areas of expertise, are trying to live lives in which they can do a certain amount of this by themselves, right? Without having necessarily to have guidance. But I think that the thing about it is that we are like those kids in that armchair who don't want to learn how to tie our own shoes, or have to put on our own shirts. There is a way in which that's really a kind of fundamental human orientation towards the world. So there are other branches of our society, I suspect, that are in the business of trying to teach this, but I think the university is the main center for it now. And I think that this is a very difficult time for educators for that reason.
I think it's a very dangerous moment, frankly, because I see this particularly in my students who are trying to become journalists, who go home or tell their friends what they want to be, and their friends say, there's no business for you. There's no future in that. It's all fake. Why would you bother devoting a life to that? And this came up, and this is very much, how could you begin classes here on Monday, certainly journalism classes on Monday after January 6th, without saying something about it? And here's 20 kids sitting there wanting to learn how to write and be a reporter or write a feature story. It's what we do in mass comm. And I know they come and see me periodically as graduation looms and say, is there going to be a job for me? Is this going to work? My mother says it'll never work. I can't do this. I can't make a living at this. And I think it takes a lot of courage right now to say, I'm going to try to do this. And I'm going to try to go back to these kind of I am vain values, for lack of a better word, right? The skepticism, the reporting on information, deciding that that's how you want to spend your life, because so many people have decided that it's not worthwhile, and I'm going to tune it out. One of the reasons why the ecosystem is failing is that people aren't buying the news, right? We don't have newspapers on our campus to any large extent at all. Right. And the website, I know what the website numbers are for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal at LSU. And, most of my students who are in other departments say it's not talked about at all as a way to be an educated student. I'm not faulting anybody. We all have priorities, but I can see that it's not a resource that's commonly shared. And I wanted to comment. I think that's a big miss.
I wanted to comment on a question that there's in the Q&A that sounds very interesting from James Toner about, we talk about uncertainty, but actually we build on foundations that we accept as certain. And I have to say that in science, that's what we do. When we talk about uncertainty, the examples that we did, those are at the frontier of science, but the same frontiers 20 years ago or 50 years ago now are accepted fact. We don't keep testing the existence of the electron. Now we look into the parts of the proton. We go into more and more fundamental questions, having accepted things that we accept as certain. And I think that, and this is a question for Michelle and Len, that I think that there were things that were accepted before with certainty that are not anymore. How the justice system works, how the news information are vetted. We I at least used to have confidence in these things, and I have less confidence on that than before. So it's not this linear construction that at least we think we have in science. We build on previous foundations. It looks like we are going in a transition in other fields, going a bit backwards for a while. I hope not forever.
But we do know that there are things like scientific revolutions, and we do know that there are enormous paradigm shifts that can completely reorient the way in which we think about not only our lives, but the world. And in an expanding universe, of course, we have new uncertainties that are confronting us. I think someone asked a question about, it has to do with the way in which we actually know now more than we did in antiquity, and that therefore we have certainties upon which we build. I like your point, Gabby, about pieces of things that we keep, pieces of things that seem to work that we keep. But this is a provisional way of thinking almost. And you don't know whether even the things you keep sometime might be blown to smithereens by something that has suddenly appeared that completely changes the ground on which we argue. So what I want to say about that is that this was actually a sensitivity that was built into early thought, philosophical thought, a long, long time ago. People were already responding to what the consequences are of what we now call scientific revolutions or paradigm shifting ways of thinking. Because you had philosophers who were trying to give the first fundamental accounts of what being is, what existence is. And, you know, they were faced with a tabula rasa. Nobody had spoken of these things before. And so, you know, you have one school that develops ways of accounting for things that are then completely denied and turned upside down by another school. So my point is that somebody also asked whether it was more or less stressful to live back then, given the fact that we know a lot more things with certainty now. And I'm really not sure that we do know a lot more things, certainly now in this sense, that our cognitive frames continue to shift. And particularly in astronomy and astrophysics, we are having to adapt to these ideas of the very large that also make us think about quantum mechanics and the very, very small. These are mind-blowing things that we're thinking about now. And they produce fundamental questions about really the assumptions that we make about most everything, you know. These are pieces of, these are bits of data that are emerging now that we don't yet know how to interpret in a way that can explain the consequences for us. But they do come into philosophical discussion and to, you know, discussions about how do you live your life, because we're always trying to think of what these discoveries might mean for us. Now, I mean, I know Len is referring to a world where people don't think about these things at all, perhaps, because these things reach us in the form of Twitter messages or memes about an event that has happened or something like that, something that was seen, something that was heard, something that was detected. But I think there's always been a challenge forever in thinking hard on anything. I'm not sure humans have changed that much over 2 millennia, that we are any less or more capable of thinking hard about things. But I do think that skepticism, if it's not going to slide into cynicism, has to be a kind of rigorous thing that doesn't lead us, you know, on the one hand into apathy and indifference, because who knows, right? That's soft skepticism. But there's also the rigorous skepticism that doesn't deny the apparent certainties that science is giving us, but that says perhaps and maybe. That's also not a bad way to live your life in general, about even things that you hold very dear, I think, is to say perhaps or that may be.
True. What I know for certain is that we're past 5 o'clock, which means we've been going an hour and a half. So I'm going to say that we will pause here and then remind you that we will continue this fascinating conversation with a new set of speakers on March 24th and again on Wednesday, April 14th. That information is available, the schedule and the registration on the Vogelin site. And to crib from Michelle here, I hope that everyone goes home and finds ataraxia, at least for this evening, a moment of balance. Thank you all for joining us. Certainly appreciate Len and Michelle and Gabby, your contributions here. This was a great conversation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for
Thank you.
inviting me.
Thank you all.
Thank you.